And go ahead and take over, Jim.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mohammed. And thanks to everybody in Group 1017 and Julie and Group 23, et cetera, for having me. As Mohammed said, I'm the Sri Lanka country specialist for Amnesty International USA. I will try to share my screen, show a few slides to talk about the Sri Lanka campaign, what's happened to date, and where we are now. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Loud and clear.
So the campaign, for those who don't know, started at the beginning of 2023. It was meant to be a campaign for the first quarter of the year, but it's gone on because of events in Sri Lanka. Just a little background. Amnesty globally started a global campaign called Protect the Protest last year. And that campaign is going on for a couple years and has 10 focus countries in different regions of the world. In Sri Lanka, one of the focus countries, in Asia rather, Sri Lanka is one of the focus countries. So I proposed to the AIUSA staff toward the latter half of last year that AIUSA run a campaign on Sri Lanka as part of the global campaign, with the focus being on a particular law, as the slide tells you. It's something called the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It's a law that's been on the books in Sri Lanka since 1979. It's used to facilitate torture, since it allows detainees to have their confessions extracted from them while they're being detained, and then those confessions are admissible in court to get convictions. It also has facilitated enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention. Amnesty has long called for the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which I'm going to call the PTA for short, to be repealed because it violates international human rights standards on arrest and detention. The Sri Lankan government last year, as you may be aware, had an unprecedented economic crisis due to government mismanagement of the economy. And that resulted in widespread peaceful public protest. And the government then had a change because in July, the protesters occupied the presidential palace and the president wound up fleeing the country and resigning. The prime minister and cabinet had already resigned. So there was an interim prime minister who then became acting president, who then became president after President Rajapaksa resigned. President Wickremesinghe, the new president, came into power and said to the country, we need to calm everything down. We have to work with the IMF to stabilize the economy. We can't have public protest. The IMF and the other creditors won't work with us. So he basically has been using the Prevention of Terrorism Act to suppress any more public protests. Now, the European Union and others are not happy with the Prevention of Terrorism Act and have been telling the government they need to fix it or repeal it. President Wickremesinghe told the EU that, oh, we're going to fix the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We're going to introduce a successor to it, repeal the PTA, and bring in a successor that would meet all the international standards. And we'll get that done by the end of March of 2023. So I propose this campaign to coincide with the proposed successor to the PTA and to ensure that whatever successor was proposed would meet international standards. The strategy for the campaign involved both direct appeals to the Sri Lankan government, as well as to get the US government to speak up about the PTA and any proposed successor. The government did propose a new bill called the Anti-Terrorism Act, the ATA, to replace the PTA, and they published that at the end of March. So let's see if I can move on to the next slide. So what we were doing then was to get the US government to tell the Sri Lankan government that the PTA had to be repealed and that the ATA, which actually turned out to be worse than the PTA in some respects, had to be either dropped completely or substantially revised. So in order to get attention within the public, to the Sri Lankan government, to the US government, we engaged a number of tactics, including activists in both the US and our fellow activists in the UK. So if you look at the photos in this slide, the two photos on the left with people holding signs, those were taken by activists in the UK, part of AI UK, who had told, I know the Sri Lanka coordinator in AI UK, Jerry, is a very nice guy. And I told him about this AI USA campaign. He'd said they would help to the extent they could. So one of our tactics was to have this photo action, which you can see was participated in by AI UK, as well as AI USA, as you'll see. We also have a landing page on the campaign on the AI USA website with the online actions. I hope everyone's taken them. If you haven't, I'll put the link to the landing page, and please, it's writing to your members of Congress and writing to the Sri Lankan government directly. The other thing we did was at the AGM, the annual general meeting of AI USA, at the beginning of March of this year in San Diego, we had this very large banner. That's the photo at the bottom on the right, done as part of a group photo action at the AGM. I then was sent that banner because I'm in Chicago, and I then used it at a Chicago event about 3 weeks ago, and that's the upper right. You may be familiar with Get on the Bus. It's an annual event at Group 133 in Somerville, Massachusetts. It's put on for years, where before the pandemic, they would get people together. Everybody would travel to New York City and troop around, demonstrating in front of various UN missions. And they've included Sri Lanka as part of their actions. Since the pandemic, it's been a virtual event. And the one they held this year was a virtual event and included a speaker actually from the north of Sri Lanka who talked about the PTA and the effect it's had on trying to protest there. More signs of participation in the photo action, which your group would be, I'd be happy to have your group participate in if you want. We had both the board of directors of AI USA. The photo at the bottom in the middle was a meeting of the AI USA board of directors during the AGM, and they nicely included as part of that meeting a participation in the photo action for the Sri Lanka campaign. In fact, it wasn't just AI USA. AI as a global movement has an international board, which oversees the movement globally. And the other photos on the top and on the right are members of AI's international board. I happen to know some of them, and I'd asked them if they'd be willing to help with the campaign. If you don't recognize her at the bottom left, that's Agnes Kellamard, who is the current Secretary General of Amnesty International. And she participated in the photo action for the campaign, and which we have then, of course, took these photos and sent them around on social media. And we know the Sri Lankan government is looking at our social media. So it's more pressure on the Sri Lankan government. Some more tactics we've used for the campaign. We had geofencing, which is in Washington, DC, if you're within certain geographic areas and you get on certain websites, you'll see a banner ad at the top of the website for the campaign. Examples of that are at the top. Those little 4 boxes. We also had a truck with a mobile billboard with the campaign message, drive around Washington in front of the US Capitol and over by the Sri Lankan embassy. And the large photo on the left shows we had the truck there on a day when the embassy opened its doors to the public as part of an annual event that embassies do in DC, where they want to promote their country and promote tourism to their countries. And so multiple embassies open their doors. It's publicized in the area. I think it's called Round the World Tour. And so we knew there would be public people going to the embassy, and we thought those people should get a sense of Amnesty's concerns, specifically on this campaign. The other photo, you see a copy of the Washington Post. This was another tactic we did in March. We had copies of the Washington Post for that day wrapped in plastic, and on the outside, we had a wrap ad with a campaign message. Those copies were delivered to every congressional office on Capitol Hill. So every member of Congress, if they looked at it, or at least someone on their staff, should have seen our campaign on Sri Lanka. The Washington, D.C. staff have told me in their discussions with congressional staff, people saw the truck and they were aware of the campaign. So we've had an impact. People in Congress, staff at least, are aware of Amnesty's concerns about the PTA and the need to protect the right to protest. We also got coverage in the Sri Lankan media. Bottom 2, actually all of these are Sri Lankan news websites. The Daily Mirror at bottom right is a Sri Lankan paper. Amnesty International USA itself issued a couple of press releases that I was involved in helping to write. And because we hadn't gotten anything yet at that point from the International Secretariat, but we worked with them to come up with timely press releases, which were published by AIUSA and then shared on social media. I have an email list that I send everything that we put out on Sri Lanka to my list, which includes Sri Lankan government officials, interested Sri Lankan journalists. So people reading the Sri Lankan media saw that Amnesty International was concerned about the new proposed Anti-Terrorism Act. We weren't the only ones concerned. There was criticism of the proposed act, both by the European Union, by UN special rapporteurs who were concerned about implications for the right to free expression, the right for assembly, as well as Sri Lankan civil rights and human rights groups who were concerned about the implications of the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act. So there was both international and domestic criticism. So part of the outcomes of the campaign so far have been the Minister of Justice published the draft ATA at the end of March and had told everyone they would start the process of enactment by tabling it in Parliament at the end of April. They didn't. Nothing happened at the end of April. Instead, right at the end of April, the minister announced that the government would take a pause on the ATA and take the month of May to take comments from the public in Sri Lanka. And they publicized a special email address. Here, you can write to this email address and give us any comments you might have on the proposed ATA. We saw this as a victory for all the criticism that had been done, both by Amnesty and by others. We also got the US ambassador, Julie Chung, to Sri Lanka to comment publicly about the ATA. And on the left, you can see a tweet she put out where she met with the Minister of Justice. And this act, because it relates to arrest and detention, is under the Ministry of Justice in Sri Lanka. So it's the Minister of Justice who has the overall responsibility for the PTA and now the ATA. So what she's saying in her tweet is she discussed her concerns with him about the ATA and the need for international standards to be observed. We also had Representative Johnson hold a briefing for members of Congress in response to our urging. And he is a member of what's called the Sri Lanka caucus in the House. So we know his office has an interest in Sri Lanka already. They're working on a possible letter from the caucus, which is still in the works. And there might be a second briefing as well. There also have been calls by the UK and other European countries, as well as the EU, that have said we're very concerned about the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act and how it doesn't meet international standards. I come to the end of my slides, but of course, every time I want to tell people about Sri Lanka, I want people to take action. So if you haven't already taken action, I'd ask you to do the online actions with the action both directly to the Minister of Justice and the Sri Lankan ambassador to the United States, as well as to your members of Congress. Now, Julie and people in your group had already mentioned part of what's been happening, particularly in April and this month is, and I really appreciate it, people are going to Congress and talking about Amnesty's concerns in Sri Lanka. And I'm happy to help work with your group on that. Or to put you in touch with the DC staff who can also give advice. So, and one of the actions is to maintain the pressure on Ambassador Julie Chung, make her aware that people in Amnesty are still concerned. So we're hoping at this point that the government hasn't said anything. The end of May has come and gone. It's now June 5th. If we're fortunate, the government will basically shelve the ATA and not proceed with it. Because if they were to proceed with it, it would get worse in Sri Lanka. And we are still then going to maintain our pressure for the government to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, because that's still on the books. And until they repeal it, we are going to demand that they institute a moratorium on its use. So they just in the last month arrested 4 more people using the PTA, which is still on the books and can be used. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah. Okay, so there were a couple of questions in the chat. So Wally, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, yes. So early in your talk, you mentioned that the government had stated that the IMF will not work with a country that is experiencing peaceful protests. Is that a true statement? Is that something that's true, or is that just propaganda from the government?
It's mostly propaganda, but let me try to be accurate. When you have a government like Sri Lanka that's a debtor and is bankrupt, they owe more than they can afford to repay. So what is going on now is the Sri Lankan government is negotiating with all of their debtor or all their creditors. They owe a fair amount to China, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, and others, and private creditors. In India, they owe a fair amount to India. So, and the European creditors are in something called the Paris Club. So the IMF is telling the Sri Lankan government, and this is what they do generally, is we will give you a loan, but you have to get all your creditors to agree that they need to take a haircut. You can't take our money and just pay everybody off in full. Everybody needs to feel some pain. And so if you're going to have a debtor government negotiate with all their creditors, and with the IMF. You're going to need that government to be stable. The creditors aren't going to negotiate with a Sri Lankan government if they think they're going to get tossed out of power in the next week, or they can make promises, but they can't fulfill them. So what the creditors and the IMF are going to want to see is, how is the government going to cut down on their expenditures? How are they going to increase their revenue? Increasing revenue will probably mean increasing taxes. That's going to be unpopular. Is your government stable enough and has enough domestic political support to be able to implement what you're promising? So the government has a point to an extent that you don't want violent protests that might overthrow the government. But a government that doesn't allow peaceful protest that's propaganda. The IMF is not saying there can't be any disagreement within the country. It's going to want the government to get political support domestically to carry out a program that's going to be sustainable. So yes, all the creditors in the IMF want to see a stable government, but you don't have stability by suppressing everybody who disagrees with you, if I'm making some sense.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Our next question is from Sam. Sam, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Thank you, sir, for presenting. That was just basically a follow-up to the last question. It seemed to me that the IMF, you actually answered it. They simply want stability before they start releasing funds and want to see a plan. I've heard that Sri Lanka is a very beautiful country. I've only seen pictures and I have friends that are from there, actually. Would tourism ever be a way to generate some stability once safety and things like that are restored? And I'll close with that question.
That's a very good question. One of the problems they had because of the pandemic was tourism dried up, as you would expect. When the pandemic hit, the world shut down. Sri Lanka imports a lot more than they export. So they need foreign currency to pay for their imports. One of their primary sources for getting foreign currency was tourism. So when the tourism dried up, that really cut into their ability to get dollars and other hard currencies. And they should have gone to the IMF earlier. They put it off and they kept using their hard currency to pay off their international debt that was denominated in dollars or other currencies, not the Sri Lankan rupee. So that is eventually why they ran out of foreign currency and couldn't afford to pay their international debt because they had no money to pay it with. And the Sri Lankan rupee depreciated against the dollar, and there has been very dramatic inflation. It was just a perfect storm of all these things hitting them all at once. With inflation, no foreign currency, no tourism. They couldn't export because that also was affected when Russia invaded Ukraine. That caused a lot of chaos in global markets for fuel and food, which created everything for them to import got more expensive than it used to be. So yes, what they need now is they need tourism desperately. The country is calm. The inflation has dropped from being somewhere in the 70%. It's now only 25%, which is very large or high for most of the time. For them, it shows they've gotten some stability. There were these very long lines at gas stations, food stores, and those have mostly gone away lately. So yes, tourism is very important to them and is a way. So people have sometimes asked, does Amnesty have a position on economic sanctions on Sri Lanka? We don't. And I wouldn't want to say, don't go to Sri Lanka because they could use the dollars.
Right. Thanks, Jim. Okay, Howard has two questions. Howard, can you unmute yourself and ask your questions, please?
Yes. Is there any one of the creditors that particularly has political influence with the government? In particular, I was thinking if India, the Modi government would be able to influence people or to do things with them since they're geographically close.
India is very important to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is also, in recent years, at least the last decade, has made some moves toward China. China is a very big creditor, and one of the holdups in the whole restructuring of the debt process has been to try to get the Chinese to agree to not simply put off the maturity of their debt and have it payable later, but actually agree not to get paid back everything. India is very concerned about Sri Lanka's moves toward China because they see this as part of an overall Chinese strategy to encircle India. And so the Sri Lankans are doing what they can. They try to play everybody off against each other to some extent to maintain their freedom of movement. So India gave Sri Lanka a lot of help, a lot of grants last year, not just loans, to help them deal with the worst of the economic disasters they were going through. So and historically, they've always been extremely important politically in the Sri Lankan politics. So yes, I can't underestimate the influence India has. At the same time, the Sri Lankans are looking to China and the West to also get some help.
Would they possibly be a possible military basin or for U.S.-based naval power in the Indian Ocean in exchange for some financial support? In other words, be trading, leasing, and basing and that sort of thing rather than direct coins to help them out. I know that that's not popular in the third world, but we need
the Indians would have an alert. I'm sorry, we were asking if it'd be possible for the U.S. to get a military base there?
Yeah, what I'm thinking is there was some sort of lease on a military base so that rather than dealing with the Indian Navy, they'd be dealing with ours.
Yeah.
Which would not be as direct an independence threat to them. They're just, we've got the example of the kid Tiago Garcia, okay, on the other side of India, that we've used for projecting power. And I'm thinking that they need the money and we need the strategic reach. But it's a tough call for them, I understand.
There's a town on the northeastern coast of Sri Lanka, a town called Trincomalee, which has a harbor. And I'm told that harbor and that part of the Indian Ocean is the best harbor, that it's better than the Indian coast along that side. And Vivek might correct me if I'm getting the geography wrong.
Yeah.
But it was important. One of the reasons the Europeans wanted control on Sri Lanka was for access to that harbor. When the monsoon blew a certain way, you wanted to be able to put your boats in a harbor that was close. And Trincomalee gave a better protection for the ships. So India would have a very allergic reaction if any foreign government had any kind of rights to that harbor at this point, including the US. They see, the Indian Ocean is their territory. And the US Navy is there, the Chinese are there, it's open, it's the law of the sea. And when Sri Lanka became independent from Britain in 1948, I'm giving you guys way too much history, but maybe you can, just for context.
Yeah.
But they became independent from Britain in 48. The British maintained a connection for their defense forces.
Yep.
And the Soviets said, well, we shouldn't let Sri Lanka enter the UN because you're not really independent. Look, you have this deal with Britain, so they have a special relationship with you for defense. you're not really independent. The British, they eventually got the British to leave completely and end that special defense arrangement. And then they got admitted to the UN. So, and the Indians would remember that as well. They're not going to want anyone who's not India, not the Indian government, to have rights. They're already allergic to, there's a port on the southern coast called Hambantota that has been financed by the Chinese.
Yep.
And unfortunately, it hasn't made the kind of money that it was supposed to make to pay back the debt. So
Yep.
one of the things the Sri Lankans have done is say, okay, we're going to turn the port over to our Chinese creditors. The Indians are very unhappy about that. And every so often you get these articles saying, oh, could Hambantota be used by the Chinese military? Can the Navy come and have a ship there? And the Sri Lankans will go, no, no, no. The Chinese Navy is not going to be using Hambantota. So try to calm the Indians down. So it's geopolitics. It happens everywhere.
But the reason I'm sort of bringing it up is the U.S. record is not ideal.
No.
But we're pretty good at being where we need to be strategically and then staying out of, we're in and out of the Philippines. We've been in and out of several places. And I'm thinking if we gave them enough money to pay off the Chinese, which might make the Chinese happy, in exchange for just having basing rights for a limited period of time, 25 years, pick a number, that's something where everybody could win. And that's all I'm trying to figure out is how you can give them, how you can directly pay off the creditors, get something in return for it that's worth your while. And that's
an interesting point. Yeah. But one of the things you have to think about is if you're the U.S. government, you're trying to move closer to the Indians. Mm-hmm. You're trying to get everybody, organized against China. The Indians fought a war with China. Not the Chinese friends.
I know.
So you don't want to jeopardize what you hope is a growing relationship with India by getting something in Sri Lanka. I mean, the U.S. government works with Sri Lanka. We've given them patrol boats, leftover Coast Guard patrol boats.
Yeah.
It's like, we're your friends. Here's a patrol boat for your Navy. And the Sri Lankans are very grateful. It's been refurbished and it's I presume it's in relatively good shape. They have done exercises with the Sri Lankans. But it's an interesting question. I think when you're the US government, you have to kind of weigh pros and cons of different. It'd be great to have a base there, but if it's going to antagonize the Indians, it may not be worth the cost.
Now, the only way I can say you can get around it is you would have to pay off both the Indian and the Chinese creditors to keep both of them happy.
The Indians aren't going to give up their, they're the big brother.
Understand.
Geography means they're the big brother. You can't buy, the Indians aren't going anywhere. So paying them off is not going to solve their problem of like, now you're in my backyard in a way I don't like.
Okay, I understand. Appreciate your patience with me.
No, it's an interesting, I hadn't thought about that, but I've just been observing for decades the whole geopolitical situation. I'm not the pundit who gets paid for this stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. All right. So I will ask the last question, and we have a couple minutes before we wrap this up. A few years back, there was a separation movement in Sri Lanka. I think the Tamil Tigers, they want to, carve out a piece of Sri Lanka and create a I don't know, some independent entity or something. Do you see any of the remnants of what happened to the Tamil Tigers in the current protest movement?
No. And for those who aren't familiar with the history of Sri Lanka, and I assume most people aren't, as Muhammad said, there was a 26-year civil war. And to explain that, I have to give you a little more details. So you have about 22 million people in the country, roughly. Of that population, about 73% are Sinhalese. They speak Sinhala. Most of them are Buddhist. There's a small Christian minority. The two major minority groups are the Tamils, who speak Tamil, a different language, different alphabet, and are mostly Hindu. There's a small Christian minority. There's also a Muslim minority who identify as Muslim, although they speak Tamil for the most part. So the Tamils see the north and east of the island as their traditional homeland. When they got independence from Britain, the parliamentary democracy with Sinhalese-based political parties that competed with each other to say, we Sinhalese are the majority, and the British gave the Tamils a disproportionate share of jobs and government jobs and professions. It's time for us to get our own back. So they took a number of steps which made the Tamils feel like second-class citizens. The Tamils said, well, this is unfair, and started agitating for autonomy in the north and east. That went nowhere. You had Tamil guerrilla groups among the youth spring up in the 70s. Eventually, the Tamil Tigers became the main Tamil separatist group, fighting for what they called Tamil Elam, an independent Tamil state in the north and east. That civil war ended in 2009 with a government military victory over the Tigers, killing the Tiger leadership, recapturing all the territory the Tigers had controlled. And whenever Sinhalese chauvinists want to say, oh, well, the Tamils might rise up again, they say, well, there could be remnants of the Tigers who might try to reorganize. Nobody's seen any evidence of that. When the protest happened last year, one of the things that was remarkable was that it started in the South, which is mostly Sinhalese. And it was mostly middle-class Sinhalese families who were protesting, although they were then joined by Tamils and Muslims. There had separately been, or has been since 2017, a separate protest going on in the north by mothers of Tamils who were rounded up, their sons and daughters at the end of the war. And the army said, as they were rounding up about 200,000 to 300,000 civilians who were there with the Tigers at the end, they said, if you had any connection with the Tigers, even if they had only drafted you for the last 2 days, come and turn yourself in, because if we find you later, it's going to be really bad for you. So mothers and fathers were taking their children, the Tigers used child soldiers, and turning them in because the military had said, it'd be better if you fess up, you were connected to the Tigers, even if for only 4 hours. And what happened at the end of the war was those people that identified themselves were taken away in buses, and hundreds of people have yet to be accounted for, because the government has said, we don't know where they are, we didn't take them. And the mothers in particular said, I put my child on the bus, I saw it leave, you have them. So there have been a lot of enforced disappearances in Sri Lanka over the decades. This is one group, just to be clear. And mothers of the disappeared of that group have been continuously demonstrating in the north since 2017 in the streets every day. So that has not gotten a lot of attention internationally. Amnesty has supported them, but we haven't. So when the demonstrators in the South began rising up against the economic mismanagement, the government didn't see that. They would love to have said it was all Tiger supporters, but they couldn't. There was no evidence for that. So I mean, there are people in the diaspora, and the Tamil diaspora has spread wide across the world during the decades, some of whom I think are still Tiger supporters, but there's no evidence that anybody's tried to revive the Tigers or any kind of violent movement to overthrow, to get an independent Tamil state again.
I think, Julie, do you have a question? I don't recognize the telephone number, but I see it in the chat there said that I have a question. Is that you? Hello, Julie. All right, Julie's not there.
I added one,
Yeah,
Mohammed.
Sam, make it quick. We got like 3 minutes left.
Okay, now I just wanted to say I have a friend that does outreach. Outreach. So how can we help directly impact the people that are most vulnerable? He's doing some grassroots work out there, but is there another way that we could reach out and impact the people that are most vulnerable? I close.
I don't have any particular organizations to recommend. I can talk to the researchers and see if they do. We aren't running any kind of relief efforts as Amnesty in the country. Anything that people can do to help. There's a lot of suffering still happening. Prices are high. People can't afford food. They can't afford fuel. It may be available, but and the incomes are down. So, but I'll come back to Mohammed and Julie if I come up with any proposals.
Okay.
Thank you,
All
sir.
right, yeah. Any information I get from Jim, I'll share it with all the attendees and the membership. Okay, if there's no other questions, I want to thank you, Jim, for making this presentation. This was really very informational and very helpful. And Wally, do you have a quick announcement? Maybe 1 minute announcement.
I just sent out an announcement in the chat, reminding people that the actual paying members this year are down compared to last year when there was COVID, or the year before, for that matter. And so we're asking people who haven't paid dues this year to send us a check, and all the information's in the chat.
All right. And Jim, I want to thank you, and Vivek, thank you for joining us. Hope you give us some good feedback, to your bosses over there at Amnesty USA. And now comes
Ahmad, you all are our bosses. The members are the heartbeat of Amnesty, and so, as Chief of Staff, I feel I report to you all, and it's been an honor to be part of this discussion. And Jim, as always, thanks for the great presentation.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks.
Vivek.
Mohammed, if I can make one
Yeah,
minor
sure, go
request.
ahead. Yes.
I do maintain, as I mentioned earlier, an email list for people who are interested in staying involved with Amnesty's work on Sri Lanka. I put my email address in the chat. If anyone wants to get on my email list, I can't say it comes out any particular time frame. It's when the researchers put out something, or AIUSA puts out something. Lately, it's been a bit busy. It's usually not as busy as it has been during the campaign. So if you're interested, send me an email and I'll add you to my list. That's all, Mohammed.
Yeah. Now, Jim had a request that we ask everybody who's attended the meeting tonight if we can share your email address with Jim. Please let me know and I'll make a list and send it to Jim. I think it's basically for the actions that Jim puts out, like he just mentioned, and he will add you to his list of people that he sent that thing to. So let me know, if you can send me an email or send me a text message, and I will make that list, include your email address and send it to Jim, okay? And now comes the important part. Hey, Bob, you want to do your